Good evening, traveler. Welcome back to this quiet corner of history, where the dust settles slowly and forgotten stories wait to be remembered. Tonight, as the world outside your window grows still and the familiar sounds of the day fade into silence, I invite you to journey with me to the early decades of the 20th century, to the factory floors of New Jersey and Illinois, where young women painted watch dials with a substance they were told was harmless, a substance that would slowly steal their lives. Before we begin, I have a small request. If you are comfortable, leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. It brings me a quiet comfort to know that as I speak these words into the darkness, someone in Chicago is watching the snow fall against their window. Someone in London is wrapped in blankets against the cold. Someone in Sydney is listening as the evening settles around them. We are all connected in this moment, scattered across time zones, but united in the simple act of seeking rest. Tonight, we will tell the story of the Radium Girls, the young women who worked in dial painting factories across America, applying luminous paint to watch faces and instrument panels so they would glow in the dark. They were told the paint was safe. They were taught to shape their brushes with their lips, to point the bristles to a fine tip by placing them in their mouths again and again, hundreds of times each day. They did not know that with each brush stroke, they were swallowing death dot, so settle in. Adjust your pillow. Let your breathing slow. This is a story of corporate greed and scientific denial, of young women who fought for justice, even as their bodies crumbled from within. It is a story of courage in the face of betrayal, of truth that could not be silenced, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against it. It is a story that changed the laws of this nation and protected workers for generations to come. The night is quiet now. The factories are long closed, their workers long gone. But their story deserves to be remembered, deserves to be told in the stillness of the night, when we can give it the attention and the sorrow it deserves. Close your eyes now, if you have not already. Let the sound of my voice carry you back through the decades, to a time when radium was the wonder of the age, when science seemed to promise unlimited progress, when no one imagined that the beautiful glow of luminous paint could carry death within it. The story we are about to explore is not easy to hear, but it is important to remember. These were real women with real lives and real dreams, and their suffering should not be forgotten about the rain falls tonight, perhaps wherever you are listening. Or perhaps the stars are out, cold and distant, indifferent to human affairs. The dial painters knew both kinds of nights, the rainy ones when they hurried to work through wet streets, and the clear ones when they might have looked up at the sky and wondered about their futures. They could not have known what awaited them. No one could have known, in those early years, what price they would pay for the glow on their brushes. Let us begin, Doc, in the year 1898, in a cramped laboratory in Paris. A Polish-born scientist named Marie Curie and her husband Pierre made a discovery that would change the world. Working with pitch-blende ore, separating and refining and testing, they isolated a new element, a substance so powerfully radioactive that it glowed with an ethereal blue-green light in the darkness. They named it radium, from the Latin word for ray, and the world fell in love with it. Radium was miraculous. It glowed without heat or flame, without electricity or combustion. It seemed to produce energy from nothing, defying the known laws of physics, offering possibilities that seemed limited only by imagination. Scientists studied it with fascination. Entrepreneurs saw fortunes waiting to be made. The public embraced it with an enthusiasm that bordered on worship. Within a few years, radium was everywhere. It was added to water and sold as a health tonic. It was mixed into face creams and marketed as a beauty treatment. It was put in chocolate and bread and butter. Radium suppositories were sold to restore male vigor. Radium bath salts promised renewed vitality. The wealthy paid enormous sums to drink radium water at exclusive spas, believing they were absorbing the very essence of life itself. The dangers were not entirely unknown. Marie Curie herself carried radium in her pockets, kept it in her desk drawers, and would eventually die of a plastic anemia caused by her decades of exposure. But in those early years, the warnings were drowned out by the chorus of enthusiasm. Radium was the miracle of the age, and no one wanted to hear that miracles might come with a price. Among the many applications for radium, one proved particularly profitable: luminous paint. By mixing radium with zinc sulfide and other compounds, manufacturers could create paint that absorbed energy during the day and released it slowly in the darkness, glowing with a soft greenish light that lasted for hours. The military saw immediate applications: watch dials that glowed in the dark, instrument panels that could be read without lights, gun sights that could be aimed in the blackest night. The United States Radium Corporation was founded in 1917 in Orange, New Jersey, to meet the growing demand for luminous products. The company extracted radium from carnotite ore mined in Colorado and Utah, processed it in their New Jersey facility, and used it to manufacture luminous paint that they sold under the trade name Undark. Their primary product was watch dials, painted by hand with tiny brushes, each dial requiring dozens of careful strokes to create the glowing numbers and hands. Asterisk. The work required precision and patience. A delicate touch that could apply the paint in thin, even coats without smudging or overlapping. The company found that young women were ideally suited for this work, their smaller hands and patient temperaments perfect for the detailed task. They hired dozens, then hundreds of women, setting them at long tables in bright, clean studios, paying them by the piece rather than by the hour. The wages were excellent, among the best available to women at the time. A skilled dial painter could earn more than 3 times what a factory worker might make. Enough to support a family, enough to save for the future, enough to live with a measure of independence that few working women enjoyed. The job was clean and respectable, nothing like the dirty, dangerous work in textile mills or meatpacking plants. The women wore their own clothes, worked in well-lit rooms, and took pride in their craft. Asterisk, asterisk. They did not know that they were being poisoned. The technique that would kill them was called lip pointing. The brushes used for dial painting were made of camel hair, soft and fine, but they quickly lost their shape after being dipped in the paint. To maintain the precise point needed for detailed work, the painters were instructed to shape the bristles with their lips, rolling the brush between their lips and tongue to form a perfect tip before each stroke. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. The rhythm became automatic, hundreds of times each day, thousands of times each week. The women ingested small amounts of radium with each lip pointing, the paint sweet on their tongues, the luminous substance entering their bodies and beginning its slow, invisible work of destruction. The company assured them it was safe. The managers and supervisors told them that paint was harmless, that radium was actually good for them, that the small amounts they might swallow would only improve their health. Some women painted their nails with a luminous paint, their teeth, their faces, going out at night and laughing as they glowed in the darkness. They called themselves the Ghost Girls, proud of their association with this miraculous substance. Asterisk. The scientists and executives of the United States Radium Corporation knew better. They knew that radium was dangerous, that exposure could cause harm, that precautions were necessary. When they handled radium in their laboratories, they used lead screens and ivory-tipped forceps. They never touched the substance directly, never allowed it near their mouths, never failed to protect themselves from its invisible rays. Asterisk. But they said nothing to the women who sat at the painting tables, who put their brushes to their lips day after day, who carried radium home on their clothes and in their hair, who glowed with a light they did not understand. They came from the towns and neighborhoods surrounding the factory. Young women looking for good work in a time when good work for women was hard to find. They were the daughters of immigrants and laborers, of shopkeepers and farmers, girls who had finished school and needed to earn a living, who wanted something better than domestic service or textile work. Molly Maggia started a few months later, a dark-haired girl of 19 who dreamed of saving enough money to marry her sweetheart and start a family. She was skilled with her hands, patient and meticulous, and she took pride in the perfect dials that emerged from beneath her brush. She worked beside her two sisters, Albina and Quinta, the three of them contributing their wages to the family household. Asterisk, asterisk, Catherine Shaw was just 14 when she began, having lied about her age to get the job. She was bright and ambitious, eager to prove herself, and she quickly became one of the studio's most productive workers. She painted thousands of dials over the years that followed, each one bringing her closer to the comfortable future she imagined for herself. There were hundreds of others whose names have been largely forgotten, women who worked at the Orange Studio and at similar facilities that opened in Waterbury, Connecticut, and Ottawa, Illinois. They came from all backgrounds, all circumstances, united by the work they did and by the fate that awaited them. The dial painting studio in Orange was a large, bright room on the upper floor of the factory building. Long tables stretched in rows, each station equipped with the materials needed for the work. Small jars of luminous paint, trays of watch dials, fine-tipped brushes, and cloths for wiping away mistakes. The women sat on wooden chairs, hunched over their work, their eyes focused on the tiny numbers and hands they were painting onto the watch faces. The room had a strange atmosphere, a combination of the ordinary and the uncanny. By day, it looked like any other factory space, filled with the murmur of conversation and the soft sounds of work being done. But as evening approached and the natural light faded, the studio began to glow. The paint on the tables, on the workers' hands, on their clothes, and in their hair, all of it released its stored light, giving the room an ethereal quality that never failed to impress visitors. The women became accustomed to this glow, came to see it as simply part of the job. They noticed that the radium seemed to cling to everything, that no amount of washing could entirely remove it from their hands, that they could see each other's fingerprints glowing in the dark. Some found it amusing, a harmless curiosity. Others felt a vague unease they could not quite explain. The supervisors maintained discipline in the studio, ensuring that the women worked quickly enough to meet their quotas, but carefully enough to maintain quality. They walked between the tables, checking the finished dials, returning any that did not meet the company's standards. The women were paid by the dial, so rejected work meant lost wages, an incentive that kept them focused and precise. The work was repetitive, but not unpleasant. The women could talk as they painted, sharing gossip and news, discussing their lives outside the factory. Friendships formed across the painting tables, relationships that would endure through the dark years ahead. They celebrated each other's engagements and weddings, mourned each other's losses, supported each other through the ordinary trials of life. They did not yet know that they were sharing something else, something invisible and deadly, something that was already beginning to destroy them from within. The factory had rhythms that the women learned to follow, patterns that structured their days and weeks and months. Monday mornings brought fresh supplies and new orders, the week's work laid out before them. Friday afternoons brought the satisfaction of quotas met, of wages earned, of the weekend stretching ahead. The calendar was marked by holidays when the factory closed, by seasonal variations in demand, by the comings and goings of workers who left for marriage or other employment. The work year had its own texture. Summer brought heat that made the studio uncomfortable, that caused the paint to dry too quickly, that left the women tired and irritable by day's end. Winter brought cold that seeped through the windows, that made fingers stiff and slow, that required extra effort to maintain the precision the work demanded. Spring and autumn were the best times, when the temperature was moderate and the light was gentle and the work seemed almost pleasant. Through all the seasons, the dials accumulated on the tables, waiting for inspection, waiting to be shipped to customers across the country and around the world. Each dial represented hours of careful work, hundreds of brush strokes, countless instances of lip pointing. Each dial carried a tiny amount of radium, invisible but potent, ready to glow in the darkness where soldiers and sailors and ordinary citizens would read the time. The women could not know that they were leaving a part of themselves on every dial they painted, that the radium they swallowed was becoming part of their bones, that the glow they created would outlast them by decades. The dial painters took pride in their work and in their status. They were not common factory girls, not anonymous workers on an assembly line. They were skilled craftswomen, artists in their way, creators of the luminous watches that soldiers and sailors relied upon, that wealthy customers purchased from the finest jewelers. Their work mattered, and they knew it. The company encouraged this pride, treating the dial painters better than ordinary workers, providing them with comfortable facilities and respecting their skills. The women felt valued, felt that they were part of something important, something connected to the scientific marvels of the age. Radium was miraculous, and they were its handmaidens, bringing its glow to the world. Some of the women became minor celebrities in their communities, known as the girls who worked with radium, who glowed in the dark, who handled the most precious substance on Earth. They were invited to parties where they would display their luminous hands, their glowing smiles, their hair that shimmered with an otherworldly light. They were proud to be different, proud to be special, proud to be ghost girls. The wages reinforced this pride. A skilled dial painter could earn $20 a week or more, an excellent salary for a young woman in the 1910s and 1920s. The money gave them independence, allowed them to help their families, enabled them to plan for futures that seemed bright with possibility. They bought clothes and jewelry, saved for weddings and homes, dreamed of the lives they would build with the money they earned. None of them imagined that the work they were so proud of was killing them slowly, one brush stroke at a time, The social world of the dial painting studio was rich and complex. The women formed friendships that extended beyond the factory walls, meeting on weekends for picnics and outings, attending each other's weddings and christenings, building relationships that would sustain them through the dark years ahead. They shared secrets and dreams, gossip and advice, creating bonds that transcended the workplace. Some of the dial painters were sisters or cousins, family members who had followed each other into the lucrative work. The Magia sisters, Molly, Albina, and Quinta, all worked at the Orange Studio, their wages contributing to the household income. Their fates intertwined in ways they could not have imagined. Other families sent multiple daughters to the dial painting tables, drawn by wages that could transform a family's fortunes. The women developed their own culture within the studio, their own jokes and traditions, and ways of passing the time. They gave nicknames to difficult supervisors, invented games to make the repetitive work more bearable, celebrated birthdays and holidays with small gifts and treats. They created a community within the industrial space, humanizing an environment that might otherwise have been merely mechanical. The younger workers looked up to the veterans, learning from their experience, seeking their advice, hoping to match their speed and skill. The veterans, in turn, took pride in mentoring newcomers, passing on the tricks of the trade, helping them navigate the demands of the work and the expectations of the supervisors. Knowledge flowed through the studio, from experienced painters to novices, creating continuity across generations of workers. Asterisk, asterisk, the dial painters also developed their own aesthetic, taking pride in particularly beautiful dials, comparing their work, striving for a perfection that went beyond what the company required. They were craftswomen, and they brought a craftsman's sensibility to their labor, finding satisfaction in work well done, even as the work was destroying them. The first symptoms appeared quietly, almost imperceptibly, easy to dismiss as minor ailments that would surely pass. A toothache here, a sore joint there, fatigue that seemed to have no cause. The women attributed these complaints to the ordinary stresses of life, to late nights or poor sleep, to nothing that should cause real concern. Molly Maggio was among the first to notice something wrong. In 1921, 4 years after she had started at the studio, her teeth began to ache. She visited a dentist who found nothing unusual and attributed the pain to minor decay. He pulled a tooth, expecting the problem to resolve. Instead, the socket refused to heal. It gaped and oozed, the bone beneath visible and gray, the pain growing worse rather than better. Asterisk, asterisk, more teeth were pulled, one after another, each extraction, leaving a wound that would not close. The bone of her jaw began to crumble, pieces breaking off and coming away in the dentist's instruments, in her own fingers when she touched the ruined landscape of her mouth. The pain was constant and excruciating, beyond anything she had ever experienced or imagined. Doctors were baffled. They had never seen anything like this, a decay so rapid and complete, a destruction so total. They diagnosed syphilis, the standard explanation for mysterious ailments in young women, a diagnosis that brought shame on top of suffering. Molly protested that she had never been with a man, but the doctors did not believe her. The disease progressed, destroying her jaw, spreading to her throat, eating away at her from the inside. She died in September 1922, at the age of 24. The official cause of death was listed as syphilis, a lie that would stand unchallenged for years. She was buried in a grave that glowed faintly in the darkness. Her bones so saturated with radium that they would continue to emit radiation for centuries to come. Molly, Magia's death might have been an isolated tragedy, a single case of unusual disease, if not for what followed. Within months, other dial painters began to show similar symptoms. Teeth loosening and falling out, jaws crumbling, bones breaking without cause, wounds that would not heal, exhaustion that no amount of rest could relieve. Hazel Cuser developed a limp that worsened until she could barely walk, her hip deteriorating from within. Irene Rudolph watched helplessly as her jaw disintegrated, piece by piece, the bone turning to powder in her mouth. Eleanor Eckert felt her spine collapsing, the vertebrae crumbling under the weight of her own body. Sarah Malfer's legs simply gave out, the bones too weakened to support her. The women began to talk among themselves, comparing symptoms, noting the pattern that was emerging. They had all worked at the dial painting studio. They had all used the lit pointing technique. They had all swallowed radium, day after day, year after year. The connection seemed obvious, yet it was denied at every turn. The conversations happened quietly at first, in hushed tones at lunch breaks or after work. Women who were ill sought out others who might be experiencing similar problems. They compared notes on their symptoms, their doctor's diagnoses, their growing suspicions. The pattern they uncovered was disturbing. Woman after woman, all dial painters, all developing the same mysterious ailments. Some of the women confronted their supervisors, asking about the safety of the paint, demanding to know if there was a connection. They were met with reassurances and dismissals. The paint was safe, they were told. Radium was beneficial, not harmful. Their illnesses must have other causes. Perhaps they were not taking care of themselves. Perhaps they had contracted diseases through their own misbehavior. The dismissals were insulting, but also puzzling. The women knew what they had experienced, knew that healthy young women should not be losing their teeth and watching their bones crumble. They knew that there had to be an explanation, and the most obvious explanation was the substance they had been putting in their mouths every day for years. Yet the authorities, medical and corporate, insisted otherwise. The women found themselves in an impossible position. Their own experience told them one thing, while the experts told them another. They were sick, visibly and undeniably sick, yet they were told that their illness had nothing to do with their work. The cognitive dissonance was almost as painful as the physical symptoms. The United States Radium Corporation insisted that the paint was safe. That radium in small doses was actually beneficial. That the women's illnesses must have some other cause. Company doctors examined the sick workers and pronounced them healthy, or attributed their symptoms to other diseases. The company's scientists produced studies showing that radium was harmless, that the dial painters had nothing to fear, but the women knew better. They knew what they had swallowed, what they had painted on their skin, what they had breathed in day after day. They knew that something in that glowing paint was killing them, even if no one would admit it. The sick women found themselves in a peculiar kind of isolation. Their families often did not understand what was happening to them, could not comprehend diseases that had no names and no precedents. Their doctors offered treatments that did not help, diagnoses that did not fit, assurances that rang hollow. The world around them continued as if nothing had changed, while they suffered in ways that seemed to have no explanation. Some of the women drew closer together, forming bonds of solidarity with others who shared their affliction. They visited each other, compared symptoms, shared what little information they could gather about their condition. These gatherings were grim affairs, marked by the visible deterioration of women who had once been young and healthy. But they also provided comfort that could be found nowhere else. Others withdrew, embarrassed by their symptoms, ashamed of diagnoses that implied moral failing, unwilling to be seen in their diminished state. They suffered alone in darkened rooms, tended by families who did their best, but could not understand what was happening. The isolation compounded the physical suffering, adding loneliness to pain. ****. The women who were still healthy watched their sick colleagues with a mixture of sympathy and dread. They knew that they too had swallowed the paint, had breathed the radium dust, had carried the glow home on their clothes and in their hair. They wondered when their turn would come, whether they too would develop the mysterious ailments that were claiming their friends. Some quit their jobs, hoping that stopping the exposure might save them. Others continued to work, needing the income, telling themselves that they would be among the lucky ones. The denial was comprehensive and deliberate. The United States Radium Corporation had powerful reasons to reject any connection between their product and the dial painter's illnesses. Admitting fault would expose them to lawsuits, to regulatory action, to the destruction of their business. Radium was their livelihood, and they would protect it at any cost. They hired doctors and scientists to produce favorable reports, to testify that radium was safe, to discredit anyone who suggested otherwise. They pressured local health officials to dismiss the women's complaints, to attribute their illnesses to other causes, to avoid any investigation that might implicate the company. They used their wealth and influence to shape the narrative, to control the story, to ensure that the truth remained hidden. The medical establishment largely cooperated, whether through ignorance, indifference, or corruption. Doctors misdiagnosed the dial painter's ailments as syphilis, as rheumatism, as phosphorus poisoning, as anything except radium exposure. Scientists who had accepted funding from radium companies produced research supporting the safety of radium, dismissing the mounting evidence of harm. The women found themselves fighting not just their disease, but a wall of denial that seemed impenetrable. They were told they were imagining things, that their symptoms were psychological, that they had brought their illnesses on themselves through immoral behavior. They were shamed and dismissed, their suffering denied, their voices silenced. But some of them refused to be silent. Some of them began to fight back. In 1925, a pathologist at Newark City Hospital named Harrison Stanford Markland began investigating the deaths of the dial painters. Unlike the company doctors who had examined the women and pronounced them healthy, Markland approached the cases with genuine scientific curiosity and a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led. He obtained permission to examine the bodies of dial painters who had died, performing autopsies that revealed the horrifying extent of the radium damage. The bones of these women were riddled with holes, eaten away from within by the radiation they had absorbed. Their bone marrow was destroyed, their blood unable to regenerate, their bodies slowly failing from a poison that had become part of their very structure. Markland developed tests to detect radium in living patients, measuring the radiation that emanated from their bodies, proving beyond doubt that the dial painters had absorbed massive quantities of the radioactive substance. He published his findings in medical journals, presenting the evidence that radium was responsible for the women's illnesses and deaths. The response was immediate and hostile. The United States Radium Corporation attacked Martlin's methods, questioned his credentials, and produced their own scientists to contradict his findings. They accused him of bias, of incompetence, of seeking publicity at the expense of truth. They did everything in their power to discredit him and bury his research. But Martlin persisted. He continued his investigations, gathered more evidence, refined his methods, and built an irrefutable case against radium. He became an advocate for the dial painters, using his scientific authority to support their claims and expose the company's deceptions. His work would prove essential in the legal battles to combat as Martlin investigated. The statistics told their own grim story. Of the dial painters who had worked at the Orange Studio in its early years, an alarming percentage had developed serious health problems. Dozens had died, many more were ill, and the pattern was unmistakable. These women were dying at rates far exceeding what would be expected in a normal population, and they were dying of diseases that had never been seen before in such concentration. Asterisk. The company's own records, when examined closely, revealed the extent of the problem. Workers who had been employed longest showed the highest rates of illness. Those who had been most productive, who had painted the most dials, who had therefore done the most lip pointing, were the sickest. The correlation between radium exposure and disease was clear to anyone who looked at the data honestly. Yet the company continued to deny. They pointed to workers who remained healthy, ignoring the fact that disease often took years to manifest. They emphasized the benefits of radium, the jobs it provided, the products it created, the progress it represented. They wrapped themselves in the flag of science and industry, presenting themselves as victims of hysteria rather than perpetrators of harm. The dial painters. Supporters began compiling their own statistics, documenting every case they could find, building a record of suffering that could not be ignored. They tracked down former workers, interviewed families of the deceased, gathered medical records and employment histories. Slowly, the true scope of the disaster became clear. The fight over radium attracted experts from across the scientific community, some supporting the dial painters, others defending the industry. The debates were fierce and often acrimonious, with careers and fortunes at stake on both sides. Physiologists studied the way radium behaved in the body, discovering that it was absorbed into the bones and remained there indefinitely, irradiating the surrounding tissue for years or decades. The body treated radium like calcium, incorporating it into the skeletal structure, where it became a permanent source of internal radiation. Once absorbed, there was no way to remove it, no treatment that could reverse the damage. Physicists measured the radiation emitted by the dial painters, developing techniques to quantify their exposure and estimate the doses they had received. The numbers were staggering. Some of the women had absorbed amounts of radium that would have been considered dangerous, even by the lax standards of the time. Amounts that made their eventual illness essentially inevitable. But for every expert who supported the dial painters' case, the company found another who would contradict them. The scientific community was divided, and the controversy raged in journals and conferences, at medical meetings and in newspaper columns. The dial painters watched these debates with a mixture of hope and despair, their lives hanging in the balance, while experts argued about the meaning of data. The women who were still alive found themselves in a strange position, both subjects and observers of the scientific controversy swirling around them. They were examined and measured, their bodies treated as evidence in a dispute that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of workplace safety in America. Some resented being reduced to data points, to specimens in a scientific debate. Others embraced the attention, hoping that the research would finally prove what they had known all along. The investigations also revealed the extent of the cover-up that the company had perpetrated. Internal documents showed that the United States Radium Corporation had known about the dangers of radium for years, had received warnings from scientists and doctors, had watched their workers sicken and die without taking any action to protect them. The gap between what the company knew and what it told its workers was damning God. These revelations fueled the growing public outrage. The image of corporate executives protecting themselves while sending young women to their deaths was powerful and infuriating. The dial painters were no longer just sick workers seeking compensation. They were victims of deliberate corporate misconduct, symbols of everything that was wrong with an economic system that valued profit over human life. The pressure for action continued to build. In newspapers and legislatures, in courtrooms and corporate boardrooms. Something had to give. The dial painters' fight for justice was about to enter its most traumatic phase. By 1927, Grace Fryer had been sick for years. The young woman who had once been one of the fastest dial painters in the Orange studio was now barely able to walk. Her spine collapsing, her jaw deteriorating, her body failing in ways that defied medical explanation. She had watched her friends and co-workers die, one after another, and she was determined not to go quietly. Grace decided to sue the United States Radium Corporation. It was a bold decision, almost unprecedented. Workers in that era had few legal protections, and suing an employer was difficult, expensive, and rarely successful. The company had vast resources, the best lawyers money could buy, and a willingness to fight that would have discouraged most plaintiffs. Finding a lawyer willing to take the case proved nearly impossible. Grace approached attorney after attorney, firm after firm, and was rejected by all of them. Some were afraid of the powerful company. Others doubted that the case could be won. Still others did not believe the women's claims, or did not think them worth the effort. For 2 years, Grace searched for legal representation, her health declining all the while. The search for a lawyer took Grace across New Jersey and into New York, into the offices of lawyers who listened to her story and then found reasons to decline. The pattern was discouraging. Sympathy, interest, then reluctance, refusal. The excuses varied, but the result was always the same. No one wanted to take on the United States Radium Corporation. The reasons for their reluctance were understandable, if not admirable. The company was wealthy and well-connected, represented by some of the most prominent law firms in the region. A lawsuit would be expensive and time-consuming, requiring expert witnesses and extensive research. The legal theories were novel. No one had ever successfully sued for radium poisoning before, and the clients were dying, which meant the case might never reach trial. Some lawyers were more direct about their concerns. They worried about their reputations, about being seen as anti-business or radical. They worried about retaliation from powerful interests. They worried about the difficulty of proving causation when the science was still contested. They found reasons to say no, and Grace had to accept their refusals and move on. The search for legal representation became a test of Grace's determination. With each rejection, she could have given up, could have accepted her fate, could have spent her remaining days in quiet resignation. Instead, she kept searching, kept knocking on doors, kept telling her story to anyone who would listen. Her persistence was remarkable, given her deteriorating health. Finally, in 1927, a young attorney named Raymond Barry agreed to take the case. Barry was moved by the dial painter's story and outraged by the company's conduct. He would devote years of his life to their cause, fighting a legal battle that would become one of the most significant in American history. That each of the five had her own story of suffering. Catherine Schaub, who had started work at just 14, had watched her health deteriorate through her 20s until she could barely function. Quinta MacDonald had seen her sister Molly die and had spent years waiting for the same fate to claim her. Edna Hussman was in constant pain, her body riddled with the same invisible poison that had killed so many of her friends. The women knew they were dying. They knew that no verdict could save their lives, that no amount of money could undo the damage that had been done. But they wanted justice. They wanted acknowledgement of the wrong that had been committed against them. They wanted to ensure that no other workers would suffer as they had suffered. They also wanted to provide for the families they would leave behind. Most of the women had no savings, their medical expenses having consumed whatever money they had earned during their years of work. A favorable verdict might mean the difference between security and destitution for their loved ones. The case dragged on for months, delayed by legal maneuvers from the company's army of attorneys. The United States Radium Corporation used every tool at their disposal to postpone the trial, knowing that time was on their side. The longer they could delay, the more likely that the plaintiffs would die before the case could be heard, their claims dying with them. Asterisk, asterisk, the women grew sicker as the delays continued. Some could barely sit up, could barely speak, could barely sign the documents their lawyers placed before them. The press covered their decline with increasing sympathy, and public opinion began to turn against the company. The spectacle of dying women being denied their day in court stirred outrage across the country. The company offered settlements, initially insultingly small, then gradually larger as the pressure mounted. The women rejected offer after offer, determined to have their case heard, to establish the principle that workers had a right to safety, that companies could be held accountable for poisoning their employees. Asterisk, asterisk, in the end, in June 1928, a settlement was reached. Each of the five women would receive $10,000 in cash, a pension of $600 per year for life, and payment of all medical and legal expenses. It was less than they had sought, but more than the company had wanted to pay. More importantly, it was an acknowledgement of responsibility, a public admission that the company had harmed these women. Asterisk. The settlement came none too soon. Within months, several of the Radium girls were dead. They had won their battle, but at a cost that could never be repaid. The aftermath of the settlement brought mixed emotions for the surviving dial painters and their families. There was relief that the fight was over, that some measure of justice had been achieved, that the company had been forced to acknowledge its responsibility. But there was also bitterness at how long it had taken, how much suffering had been required, how inadequate the compensation seemed compared to what had been lost. The settlement money provided some security for the women and their families, but it could not restore health or undo damage. Medical bills continued to mount as the women's conditions deteriorated. Some families struggled to make the money last, to stretch the settlement over years of illness and disability. Others found that no amount of money could compensate for watching a loved one die, slowly and painfully. The women who had won the settlement became reluctant celebrities, their cases cited in newspapers and legal journals. their names invoked in debates about workplace safety and corporate responsibility. They received letters from strangers offering sympathy and support, from lawyers seeking to use their case as precedent, from journalists wanting to tell their stories. Some welcomed the attention, hoping it would help protect other workers. Others wished only to be left alone to face their remaining days in peace. The 5 women of the original lawsuit did not live long to enjoy their victory. One by one, they succumbed to the poison they had swallowed years before. Their deaths were front-page news, each one a reminder of the price they had paid and the courage they had shown. They were buried in graves that would glow for centuries, their radium-laden bones a permanent monument to corporate greed and human resilience. The story of the dial painters did not end in Orange, New Jersey. Hundreds of miles away, in the small town of Ottawa, Illinois, another group of women was suffering the same fate, poisoned by the same substance. Betrayed by a different company, they had learned nothing from the tragedy unfolding in the East. The Radium Dial Company had opened its Ottawa plant in 1922, hiring local women to paint watch dials and instrument panels with luminous paint. Like their counterparts in New Jersey, the Ottawa dial painters were taught the lip-pointing technique. Like their counterparts, they were assured that the paint was safe. Like their counterparts, they swallowed radium day after day, week after week, year after year. The company knew about the illnesses and deaths in Orange. The industry was small, and news traveled quickly. But they said nothing to their workers, made no changes to their procedures, took no precautions to protect the women who sat at their painting tables. The profits were too good, and the women too expendable. The decision to continue operations without warning the workers was deliberate and calculated. Company executives had access to information about the dangers of radium, had received reports about the illnesses in New Jersey, had every reason to know that their workers were at risk. They chose to ignore this information, to continue the profitable dial painting operation, to sacrifice their workers' health for their shareholders. Returns. The Ottawa operation in some ways replicated the New Jersey tragedy almost exactly. The same techniques were used, the same assurances given, the same denials offered when workers began to fall ill. It was as if the company had learned nothing from the Eastern disaster, or rather had learned only how to better manage the publicity and legal exposure. The Ottawa women were actually at greater risk than their New Jersey counterparts in some respects. The company had become more efficient at maximizing production, which meant more dials painted, more lip pointing, more radium swallowed. The women of Ottawa absorbed the poison even more rapidly than the women of Orange had. The company's behavior in Ottawa revealed the true nature of corporate indifference. This was not a case of genuine ignorance, of a company that did not know any better. This was a company that knew the risks and chose to accept them, that made a business decision to trade workers' lives for profits. The callousness was breathtaking. The Ottawa women were even more isolated than their New Jersey sisters. They lived in a small town where the Radium Dial Company was a major employer, where challenging the company meant challenging the economic foundation of the community. They were surrounded by friends and neighbors who worked for the company or depended on those who did. Speaking out meant risking not just their jobs, but their place in the community. By the late 1920s, the Ottawa dial painters were beginning to show the same symptoms that had devastated the New Jersey women: toothaches and jaw pain, bones that broke without cause, exhaustion that sleep could not cure. The women compared notes, shared their fears. and began to suspect that something was terribly wrong. Margaret Looney was one of the first to fall seriously ill. She had worked at the Ottawa plant for years, painting thousands of dials, swallowing countless doses of radium. In 1929, her leg began to ache. Within months, it had to be amputated. The bone was so saturated with radium that it continued to glow in the hospital laboratory. Peg Looney, as her friends called her, did not survive long after her amputation. She died in August 1929 at the age of 24, one of the first documented fatalities from radium poisoning in Ottawa. But she was far from the last. Catherine Wolfe was next, then Marie Rossiter, then Ella Cruz. The deaths came faster now, the illnesses more severe, the denial from the company more desperate. Women who had worked side by side watched each other sicken and die, knowing that their turn would come, that the poison they had swallowed was already at work in their own bodies. Radium Dial Company responded to the crisis with a campaign of denial and deception that made the United States Radium Corporation look almost honest by comparison. They hired medical consultants who examined the sick workers and pronounced them healthy, or attributed their symptoms to other causes. They produced scientific reports claiming that their paint was safe, that their workers had nothing to fear. When confronted with the evidence from New Jersey, the company insisted that their operations were different, their paint less dangerous, their procedures safer. They blamed the workers themselves for their illnesses, suggesting that they had been careless or had exposed themselves to radium outside of work. They did everything possible to avoid responsibility. The company even continued to hire new workers, replacing those who had become too sick to work, bringing fresh young women to the painting tables without warning them of the danger. These new employees had the same optimism, the same pride in their work, the same ignorance of what awaited them. The cycle continued. Meanwhile, the company's owners and managers took precautions for themselves. They wore protective clothing when handling radium. They used lead screens and remote handling tools. They never placed their brushes in their mouths, never touched the luminous paint with bare skin. They knew the danger and protected themselves while sending their workers to their deaths. The contrast between how the company treated its executives and how it treated its workers was stark and damning. In the laboratories and offices, every precaution was taken. Lead-lined containers held the radium. Ivory-tipped forceps kept fingers away from the dangerous substance. Workers who handled concentrated radium wore protective gear and underwent regular medical examinations. On the factory floor, none of these precautions existed. The dial painters worked with bare hands, placed their brushes in their mouths, breathed air filled with radium dust. They wore their own clothes, which they carried home saturated with radioactive material. They received no medical examinations, no warnings, no protection of any kind. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The same company that insisted radium was safe for its dial painters treated it as dangerous for everyone else. The same executives who assured workers that lip pointing was harmless refused to allow the practice anywhere near their own offices. The double standard revealed the true nature of the company's assurances. Not honest beliefs about safety, but calculated lies designed to protect profits at the expense of lives. When the Ottawa women began to fall ill, the company's response followed the same pattern established in New Jersey. Deny, delay, deflect. Blame the workers. Hire friendly experts. produce misleading research. The playbook had been written, and the Radium Dial Company followed it to the letter. The body's burden. As the legal battles continued and more dial painters sickened and died, scientists worked to understand exactly what radium was doing to these women's bodies. Their findings painted a picture of destruction that was both comprehensive and irreversible. When radium entered the body through ingestion, inhalation, or absorption through the skin, it behaved like calcium, one of the body's essential building blocks. The body could not distinguish between the two substances and incorporated radium into bones and teeth just as it would calcium. Once there, the radium remained, becoming a permanent part of the skeletal structure. Asterisk. From its position in the bones, the radium emitted radiation continuously, bombarding the surrounding tissue with alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays. The alpha particles were the most damaging, tearing through cells like microscopic bullets, destroying DNA, killing tissue. The bone marrow, where blood cells were produced, was particularly vulnerable. The damage accumulated over time. A single dose of radium might cause no immediate harm, but the radiation continued day after day, year after year, decade after decade. The cells struggled to repair themselves, but the assault never stopped. Eventually, the cumulative damage overwhelmed the body's defenses. One of the challenges facing scientists was measuring how much radium the dial painters had absorbed. The substance was invisible, its presence detectable only through its radiation. Specialized equipment was needed to quantify the body burden, the total amount of radium that had accumulated in a person's skeleton. Researchers developed techniques using sensitive detectors that could measure the gamma rays escaping from the body. By placing subjects in shielded chambers and recording the radiation they emitted, scientists could estimate the amount of radium they carried. The results were disturbing. Some dial painters showed body burdens hundreds of times higher than what would be considered safe by modern standards. They were walking sources of radiation, their bones continuously bombarding their own tissues with destructive particles. The levels were so high that some women could expose photographic film simply by placing it against their skin. The measurements also revealed the terrible truth that radium, once absorbed, could never be removed. Unlike some toxins that the body could eventually excrete, radium was locked into the bone matrix, held there by the same chemical bonds that held calcium. No treatment could release it. No therapy could reduce the body burden. The women would carry their poison until the day they died. The scientists documented a range of effects from radium exposure, some immediate and some delayed by years or even decades. The jaw necrosis that had killed Molly Maggia was among the most dramatic, the bone literally rotting away under the assault of internal radiation. But it was far from the only consequence. Anemia was common, the result of bone marrow destruction that impaired the production of blood cells. Women who had absorbed large amounts of radium found their blood unable to carry oxygen efficiently, leaving them exhausted and short of breath. Some developed leukemia, their bone marrow producing cancerous cells instead of healthy ones. Bone cancers appeared in many of the dial painters, sometimes years after their exposure had ended. The radiation-damaged cells eventually became malignant, growing into tumors that ate through the skeleton and spread throughout the body. These cancers were particularly aggressive and almost always fatal. Other effects were more subtle, but no less real. Immune systems weakened by radiation damage left the women vulnerable to infections. Organs near the skeleton, receiving second-hand radiation from the contaminated bones, developed their own problems. Some women lost their sight, their hearing, their ability to walk or care for themselves. The scientific evidence was overwhelming, but translating that evidence into justice for the dial painters would prove a continuing struggle. The science advanced through the efforts of researchers who saw the dial painters not just as subjects, but as human beings deserving of truth and justice. These scientists faced pressure from the radium industry, from colleagues who had accepted industry funding, from institutions that preferred controversy be avoided. But they persisted, publishing their findings, presenting their evidence, refusing to be silenced. The dial painters themselves contributed to the science in ways both willing and unwilling. They submitted to examinations and measurements, allowed their bodies to be studied and documented. Some hoped that contributing to research might lead to treatments that could help them. Others simply wanted the truth to be known, wanted their suffering to have meaning. After their deaths, many dial painters continued to serve science. Their bodies were autopsied, their bones measured, their tissues analyzed. The data gathered from the dead informed the living, helping researchers understand the long-term effects of radiation exposure. The dial painters became part of a scientific legacy that would protect workers for generations. But science alone could not bring justice. The evidence, however compelling, had to be translated into legal victories, into compensation for the victims, into changes in law and practice that would prevent future tragedies. That translation required lawyers and advocates, journalists and politicians, a coalition of people willing to fight for the dial painters' cause. By the early 1930s, Catherine Donahue had become the face of the Ottawa dial painters' struggle for justice. She had worked at the Radium Dial Company for years, painting dials and swallowing radium like all the others. Now she was dying, her body crumbling from within, her jaw destroyed, her bones riddled with holes. Asterisk, asterisk, unlike some of the other dial painters, Catherine refused to accept her fate quietly. Even as her health declined, she fought for recognition, for compensation, for acknowledgement of what had been done to her and her co-workers. She testified before investigators, spoke to reporters, and refused to let the company silence her. Catherine's determination was remarkable given her condition. By 1938, she could barely speak, her jaw so deteriorated that forming words required enormous effort. She could barely sit up, her spine collapsing under its own weight. She was in constant pain, managing it as best she could while continuing her fight. The case she brought against the Radium Dial Company would become a landmark in the history of workers' rights, establishing legal principles that would protect laborers for generations to come. In Illinois, workers' compensation claims were heard by the State Industrial Commission rather than by regular courts. This seemed to favor the company, as the commission was generally sympathetic to business interests, and its procedures limited the damages workers could recover. But Catherine Donahue and her attorneys pressed forward anyway. The hearings began in 1936 and dragged on for years, the company using every delay tactic available. Catherine's health continued to decline, and there were fears that she would die before the case could be resolved. The company seemed to be counting on exactly that outcome. The evidence presented at the hearings was overwhelming. Medical experts testified about the effects of radium, the extent of the dial painters' contamination, the certainty that their exposure had caused their illnesses. Former workers described the lip-pointing technique, the company's assurances of safety, the gradual onset of symptoms that had destroyed their lives. The company's defense was weaker than it had been in the New Jersey case. By now, the scientific evidence was too strong to ignore, the pattern too clear to deny. The company's experts struggled to explain away the obvious, and their credibility suffered with each revelation of corporate misconduct. That February 1938, the Industrial Commission ruled in favor of Catherine Donahue and the other Ottawa dial painters. The decision established that their illnesses were directly caused by their work, that the company had known about the danger and failed to protect them, and that they were entitled to compensation under Illinois Workers' Compensation Law. It was a historic victory, but it came almost too late. Catherine Donahue died just months after the ruling, in July 1938. She was 34 years old. She had spent the last years of her life fighting for justice, and she had won, but she barely lived to see the result. The case established important precedents. It affirmed that radium poisoning was an occupational disease, entitling workers to compensation. It demonstrated that companies could be held liable for hazards they knew about, but failed to address. It showed that even the most powerful corporations could be held accountable for harming their workers. The victory also inspired other dial painters to come forward, to file their own claims, to demand the compensation and recognition they deserved. The floodgates had opened, and the radium industry would never be the same. ****. The Ottawa verdict sent ripples through the industrial world. Companies that used hazardous materials began to reconsider their practices, to wonder whether they too might face legal accountability. Insurance companies that covered workplace injuries started asking harder questions about the risks their clients were exposing workers to. The calculus of industrial safety was beginning to change. The workers' compensation system itself was transformed by the dial painters' cases. The principle that occupational diseases should be compensated like occupational accidents became more firmly established. The burden of proof shifted, making it easier for workers to demonstrate that their illnesses were job-related. The procedures were streamlined, reducing the delays that had allowed companies to run out the clock on dying plaintiffs. But the changes came too late for many dial painters. By the time the legal system caught up with the scientific evidence, dozens had already died, and dozens more were too sick to benefit from any compensation they might receive. The survivors watched their friends pass away, one after another, and wondered why justice had taken so long. The Ottawa victory was Catherine Donahue's greatest achievement, but she barely lived to see it. In the months following the ruling, her condition deteriorated rapidly. The radium that had saturated her bones continued its work of destruction, eating away at her from within. She grew weaker, her pain harder to control, her moments of clarity fewer and farther between. She died on July 27, 1938, less than 6 months after the Industrial Commission ruled in her favor. She was 34 years old. She had spent the last years of her life fighting for justice, and she had won, but the victory came too late to save her. Her legacy, however, would long outlive her dot. Not all the dial painters died young. Some survived for years, even decades, living with the radium in their bones, waiting for the cancer or bone failure that might come at any time. Their survival was its own kind of burden, a constant reminder of what they had lost and what might yet be taken from them. That May, Keene was one of the lucky ones, if luck is the right word. She had worked at the Orange Studio, but had absorbed less radium than many of her colleagues, perhaps because she had not worked there as long, or perhaps because some quirk of her body had protected her. She lived into her 90s, outliving most of her coworkers by half a century. But May's long life was shadowed by what she had witnessed. She had seen her friends and colleagues die, one after another, their bodies destroyed by the same poison she carried in her own bones. She had lived with the fear of what might develop, checking constantly for symptoms, waiting for the disease that might claim her at any moment. Other survivors carried their own burdens. Some were disabled, unable to work or care for themselves. Some were disfigured, their faces marked by the jaw necrosis that had destroyed their bones. Some lived in constant pain, managing as best they could with the limited treatments available. They were living reminders of what had been done, witnesses to a tragedy that the radium industry would have preferred to forget. The dead were beyond suffering, but their legacy endured. In cemeteries across New Jersey, Illinois, and Connecticut, dial painters lay in graves that glowed faintly with the radium they had absorbed during their brief lives. Their bones continued to emit radiation, decade after decade, a silent testimony to the poison they had been forced to swallow. Some of the graves became objects of scientific study. Researchers exhumed bodies to measure the radium content, to document the extent of the contamination, to learn what they could about the long-term effects of radiation exposure. The dial painters continued to contribute to science even after death. The families of the dead carried their own burdens. Children grew up without mothers. Husbands grieved wives who had been taken too soon. Parents buried daughters who should have outlived them by decades. The ripples of the tragedy spread outward through communities, affecting hundreds of lives beyond the dial painters themselves. Many of the dead left no descendants. Their lives cut short before they could marry or have children. They existed only in faded photographs and yellowing newspaper clippings, in court records and medical reports, in the memories of those who had known them. As the years passed and those who remembered died themselves, the dial painters faded from public consciousness. But their story was too important to be forgotten entirely. The dial painters' suffering continued to echo through the decades, touching lives that had no direct connection to the factories where they worked. Medical students learned about radium poisoning from their cases, developing an understanding of radiation's effects that would shape careers and save lives. Legal scholars cited their lawsuits in arguments about corporate responsibility and workers' rights. Historians documented their struggle as part of the larger story of labor and industry in America. The survivors carried their burden of knowledge into the post-war world, a world that was increasingly confronting the dangers of radiation through the development of atomic weapons and nuclear power. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by atomic bombs in 1945, the dial painters understood the horror in ways that others could not. They knew what radiation could do to human bodies, had felt its effects in their own bones and blood. Some survivors became advocates for radiation safety, speaking out about their experiences, warning others about the dangers they had faced. They testified before government committees, gave interviews to journalists, shared their stories with anyone who would listen. Their voices carried the weight of first-hand experience, of suffering endured and lessons learned. Others preferred to remain silent, to put the past behind them, to live out their remaining years without constantly revisiting the trauma of their youth. They had earned the right to privacy, to peace, to whatever normalcy they could salvage from lives disrupted by corporate greed. Their silence was as valid a response as any activism. They had given enough. The dial painter's children and grandchildren inherited a complex legacy. Some felt pride in their ancestors' courage, in the fight for justice that had changed the law. Others felt only the weight of tragedy, the sadness of lives cut short, of potential never realized. Many knew little about their family connection to the dial painters, the story having been lost or suppressed over generations. The communities where the dial painters had lived and worked also carried the legacy. In Orange and Ottawa and other towns, the radium factories had been major employers, central to the local economy. The scandals and lawsuits had disrupted these communities, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about industries they had welcomed and workers they had known. Some communities embraced the history, preserving it and learning from it. Others preferred to forget that in Ottawa, a memorial now stands to the dial painters who suffered and died there. It is a simple monument, a stone marker bearing the names of the women who worked at the Radium Dial Company and paid with their lives. Each year, on the anniversary of Catherine Donahue's death, members of the community gather to remember and to honor. The memorial serves multiple purposes. It commemorates the individual women who died, giving their names permanence in a way that their shortened lives could not achieve. It acknowledges the wrong that was done to them, the corporate greed and scientific denial that caused their suffering. And it warns future generations about the dangers of unchecked industrial power. Similar memorials exist elsewhere, in Orange, New Jersey, and in other communities touched by the dial painter's tragedy. They stand as reminders that the pursuit of profit can have human costs, that workers' lives have value, that justice sometimes comes too late, but must still be sought. The dial painters' cases transformed American law in ways that continue to affect workers today. Before their struggle, employees had few protections against workplace hazards, limited ability to sue their employers, and little legal recourse when they were harmed by their work. After, a framework of rights and responsibilities began to emerge that would eventually become the foundation of modern occupational safety law. The cases established that occupational diseases, not just workplace accidents, could be compensated under workers' compensation laws. This was a crucial distinction. An accident was a single event, easy to identify and attribute. A disease developed slowly, its causes complex and often contested. The dial painters' cases proved that diseases caused by workplace exposure were just as compensable as injuries. From factory accidents, the cases also established that employers had a duty to warn workers about known hazards. The United States Radium Corporation and the Radium Dial Company had known that radium was dangerous. They had protected themselves and their supervisors while leaving their workers ignorant of the risk. The courts held that this concealment was itself a wrong, a breach of the duty of care that employers owed their employees. Perhaps most importantly, the cases demonstrated that corporations could be held accountable for harming their workers, even when those corporations were powerful and well-connected. The dial painters had faced enormous obstacles, from company lawyers to corrupt doctors to an indifferent legal system. Their victory showed that persistence and courage could overcome even the most formidable opposition. The dial painters' cases became touchstones for the growing occupational safety movement. Labor unions and worker advocates cited them as evidence of the need for stronger protections, better enforcement, and greater corporate accountability. The women who had suffered and died became symbols of what could happen when profit was placed above people. In the decades following the dial painters' cases, a series of laws and regulations gradually improved workplace safety across America. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established basic protections for workers. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 created OSHA, the federal agency responsible for ensuring safe working conditions. Each step built on the foundation that the dial painters had helped establish, a concept of informed consent, now central to both workplace safety and medical ethics, owes something to the dial painters' struggle. The principle that people have a right to know about risks before they accept them, that concealing danger is itself a wrong, emerged in part from the outrage over what had been done to these women. The movement also adopted the dial painters' strategy of using public opinion to pressure corporations and lawmakers. The newspaper coverage of the Radium Girls' suffering, the photographs of dying women demanding justice, had swayed public sentiment and forced action when legal arguments alone might have failed. Future advocates would follow the same playbook. The story of the dial painters remains relevant today. A warning about the dangers of prioritizing profit over safety, of trusting corporations to police themselves, of allowing science to be corrupted by commercial interests, the tactics used by the radium companies, hiring friendly experts, producing misleading research, delaying legal proceedings, attacking critics, have been employed by countless industries since. Tobacco companies, lead paint manufacturers, asbestos producers, opioid makers, all have followed variations of the same playbook. The dial painter's story helps us recognize these tactics and resist them. The story also reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that rights won can be lost, that vigilance is always required. The protections that workers enjoy today exist because people fought for them, sometimes at the cost of their lives. Those protections must be defended against those who would weaken or eliminate them. The dial painters left a legacy of courage and determination that transcends their particular circumstances. They showed that ordinary people, even those who are sick and dying, can challenge powerful institutions and win. That legacy belongs to all of us. The legal changes sparked by the dial painters. Cases rippled outward through the American legal system for decades. Court decisions cited their cases as precedent, establishing principles that protected workers in industries far removed from dial painting. The right to a safe workplace, the duty of employers to warn of known hazards, the compensability of occupational diseases. All these principles were strengthened by what the dial painters had endured and what they had achieved. The changes also influenced legislation at both state and federal levels. Lawmakers who had followed the dial painters' cases understood the need for stronger protections, for more effective enforcement, for systems that did not require workers to die before action was taken. The memory of dying women demanding justice in courtrooms and commission hearings remained a powerful motivator for reform. The occupational safety movement that emerged in the decades following the dial painters' cases built on their foundation. Unions and advocacy groups cited their example when pushing for new protections. The dramatic story of young women poisoned by their employers had an emotional power that abstract arguments about workplace safety could not match. The dial painters became symbols, their names invoked whenever the cause of worker protection needed a human face. The power of their story lay in its clarity. Here were young women, wanting only to work and earn a living, betrayed by employers who knew the risks and concealed them? Here was corporate greed in its purest form, trading lives for profits, health for dividends. Here were victims who refused to accept their victimization, who fought back, who won. The narrative arc was compelling, and advocates learned to deploy it effectively. The dial painter's example also demonstrated the importance of solidarity. The women had succeeded in part because they had worked together, pooling resources, sharing information, supporting each other through the legal process. Their collective action had achieved what individual complaints could not. This lesson was not lost on labor organizers and worker advocates. The movement also adopted the dial painter's strategy of using public opinion to pressure corporations and lawmakers. The newspaper coverage of the Radium Girls' suffering, the photographs of dying women demanding justice, had swayed public sentiment and forced action when legal arguments alone might have failed. Future advocates would follow the same playbook. The dial painter's story became a template for subsequent campaigns. When asbestos workers began dying of mesothelioma, advocates pointed to the dial painters as proof that occupational diseases were compensable. When chemical workers developed cancers, lawyers cited the dial painters' cases as precedent. When any group of workers faced corporate denial of obvious hazards, the dial painter's example showed what was possible. The establishment of OSHA in 1970 was in some ways the culmination of a process that the dial painters had helped begin. The federal agency charged with ensuring safe workplaces embodied principles that the dial painters had fought for, that workers have a right to know about hazards, that employers have a duty to protect their employees, that the government has a role in ensuring that these obligations are met. The dial painters' influence extended beyond occupational safety to the broader field of public health. Their cases helped establish the principle that corporations could not hide behind scientific uncertainty when evidence of harm was accumulating. The tactics of denial and delay that the radium companies had used became recognized as strategies to be resisted rather than accepted. The dial painter's tragedy contributed enormously to scientific understanding of radiation's effects on the human body. Before their cases, the dangers of radiation were poorly understood, and safety standards were virtually non-existent. After, a body of knowledge emerged that would shape radiation protection for decades to come. Researchers studied the dial painters, both living and dead, documenting the ways that radium damaged biological systems. They learned that different types of radiation caused different kinds of harm, that alpha particles were particularly destructive when emitted inside the body, that the dose-response relationship was complex and varied by tissue type and exposure pattern. The dial painters became subjects of long-term studies that tracked their health for years or decades after their exposure ended. These studies revealed the latency period between exposure and disease, the ways that radiation damage accumulated over time, the factors that influenced individual susceptibility. Each finding added to the growing understanding of radiation biology. Asterisk, asterisk. The knowledge gained from the dial painter's suffering was applied to other fields where radiation exposure was a concern. The nuclear industry, emerging in the 1940s, used the dial painter's data to establish safety standards for its workers. Medical radiology incorporated lessons about the dangers of unnecessary exposure. Even space exploration benefited from understanding how radiation affected the human body. Before the dial painter's cases, there were no standards for safe levels of radiation exposure. Workers in various industries from medicine to research to manufacturing, were exposed to whatever levels their employers chose to permit. With no legal limits and no regulatory oversight, the dial painters' cases changed that. As the evidence of harm accumulated, pressure grew for standards that would protect workers from similar fates. Scientists and regulators began developing exposure limits based on the best available evidence. Limits that would be revised and tightened as understanding improved. The concept of the maximum permissible dose emerged from this process. This was the highest level of radiation exposure that workers could receive without unacceptable risk, a threshold that employers were required to respect. The initial standards were crude by modern measures, but they represented an enormous advance over the complete absence of protection that had prevailed before. The dial painters' bodies themselves became calibration tools for radiation measurement. By measuring the radium content of deceased painters and correlating it with their health outcomes, researchers could estimate the doses that caused various effects. This information informed the development of safety standards that protected millions of workers in subsequent decades. Research on the dial painters continued for decades after the last factories closed. Scientists tracked surviving painters, documenting their health outcomes, measuring their body burdens, noting when and how they died. This long-term follow-up provided valuable data on the effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure. The studies revealed that the danger did not diminish with time. Dial painters continued to develop cancers and other radiation-related diseases years or even decades after their exposure ended. The radium in their bones went on emitting radiation, went on damaging tissue, went on causing harm. There was no escape from the poison they carried within them. These findings had implications far beyond the dial painting industry. They suggested that any radiation exposure carried some risk, that there was no truly safe dose, that the effects could appear long after the exposure itself. These insights shaped radiation protection policies worldwide and continue to inform our understanding of radiation's dangers. The dial painters, in death as in life, served the cause of science. Their suffering was not in vain if it helped protect others from similar fates. The research sparked by the dial painters, tragedy extended far beyond the immediate question of radium poisoning. Scientists studying the women's cases developed techniques and concepts that would prove applicable to a wide range of radiation hazards. The methods for measuring body burdens of radioactive materials, the models for predicting health effects from various doses, the frameworks for setting safety standards, all of these emerged from or were informed by research on the dial painters. The atomic age brought new urgency to radiation research. As the United States developed nuclear weapons and nuclear power, understanding radiation's effects became a matter of national importance. The dial painters' data provided baseline information that helped scientists predict and prevent harm to workers in the new nuclear industries. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, researchers found disturbing parallels between the victims' symptoms and what the dial painters had experienced. The connection between internal radiation exposure and bone cancer, first established in the dial painters, helped scientists understand what the atomic bomb survivors were facing. The dial painters' tragedy had created knowledge that, ironically, helped address an even larger catastrophe. The Cold War brought continued research, as both superpowers sought to understand the effects of radiation on human populations. Dial painters remained relevant subjects of study their long-term health outcomes providing data that could not be obtained in any other way. They became part of the scientific literature on radiation biology, cited in papers and textbooks for decades after the factories closed. Even today, the dial painters' cases inform radiation protection. Modern safety standards incorporate lessons learned from their suffering. The principle that radiation exposure should be kept as low as reasonably achievable, a cornerstone of contemporary radiation protection, owes something to the dial painter's example of what happens when no limits are imposed. The dial painting. Companies eventually faced consequences for what they had done, though the punishment never matched the crime. The United States Radium Corporation paid settlements to the Radium Girls and their families, but continued operating for years afterward, shifting to other products. As the dial painting business became untenable, the Radium Dial Company closed its Ottawa plant in 1936, amid the controversy over its workers' illnesses. The company's owners claimed bankruptcy to avoid paying full compensation to their victims, a tactic that left many dial painters with nothing despite their legal victories. Both companies left behind contaminated sites that would require cleanup decades later. The buildings where dial painting had occurred were so saturated with radium that they posed ongoing hazards to anyone who entered them. The soil around the factories was contaminated with radioactive waste. The environmental legacy of the industry proved nearly as persistent as the poison in the dial painter's bones. The contamination spread in ways that the companies had never anticipated or acknowledged. Workers had carried radium home on their clothes, depositing it in their houses, in the streets they walked, in every space they occupied. The factories themselves had released radium into the air and water, contaminating the surrounding environment. What had seemed like a contained industrial process had actually spread radioactive material throughout entire communities. The discovery of this widespread contamination came decades after the factories closed, when environmental surveys revealed elevated radiation levels in unexpected places. Homes near the factory sites showed contamination. Yards where dial painters had shaken out their work clothes were radioactive. The poison had seeped into the fabric of communities, invisible but persistent. Some executives from the companies faced personal consequences, though not imprisonment or criminal prosecution. Their reputations were damaged, their business dealings scrutinized, their place in history secured as villains rather than heroes. But they generally escaped the kind of punishment that might have deterred others from similar conduct. The lack of criminal accountability was one of the most troubling aspects of the dial painter's story. Company executives had knowingly exposed workers to deadly hazards, had concealed information about the dangers, had lied to workers and doctors and investigators. These actions seemed to meet any reasonable definition of criminal behavior, yet no one went to prison. The civil penalties, while significant by the standards of the time, were far less than the profits the companies had extracted from their deadly enterprise. The settlements paid to dial painters and their families, the cleanup costs eventually, borne by the companies or their successors, the legal fees and adverse publicity, all of these were costs of doing business, absorbed and moved past. The companies had gambled with workers' lives and, in financial terms at least, had largely won. The broader radium industry responded to the dial painter's tragedy with a mixture of reform and denial. Some companies improved their safety practices, eliminating lip pointing, providing protective equipment, and monitoring workers for radiation exposure. Others continued dangerous practices as long as they could, until regulation or litigation forced them to change. The dial painting industry itself gradually disappeared, replaced by other luminous technologies that did not require radioactive materials. Tritium and phosphorescent compounds eventually supplanted radium in watch dials and instrument panels, eliminating the need for the hand painting that had poisoned so many workers. But the attitudes that had created the dial painter's tragedy, the prioritization of profit over safety, the dismissal of workers' health concerns, the corruption of science to serve commercial interests, these persisted in other industries and other contexts. The dial painter's story became a cautionary tale, but not everyone heeded its warnings. The dial painter's tragedy offered lessons that responsible businesses took to heart. Companies learned that concealing hazards from workers was not just immoral, but legally and financially risky. They learned that denying scientific evidence would not make it go away. They learned that workers' health had to be protected, not just for ethical reasons, but for practical ones. Some industries internalized these lessons more than others. The emerging nuclear industry, acutely aware of radiation hazards, developed extensive safety protocols informed by the dial painter's experience. Other industries were slower to learn, repeating the same patterns of denial and delay that had characterized the radium company's response. The dial painter's story became part of the curriculum in business ethics, in public health, in labor history. Students learned about the women who had been poisoned, about the companies that had poisoned them, about the long struggle for justice and the reforms that eventually emerged. Each new generation was warned about the dangers of corporate misconduct and the importance of worker protection. The full human cost of the dial painting industry will never be known precisely. Records are incomplete. Diagnoses were often wrong. In many cases were never documented. But the available evidence suggests that hundreds of dial painters were sickened by their work, and that dozens or perhaps hundreds died as a direct result of radium exposure. In Orange, New Jersey, where the United States Radium Corporation operated, at least 18 dial painters died from radium poisoning, and many more suffered serious health effects. In Ottawa, Illinois, the Radium Dial Company's operations killed at least 35 women, with additional deaths likely undocumented. Other dial painting facilities in Connecticut, New York, and elsewhere added to the toll. Beyond the deaths, countless dial painters lived with disability, chronic pain, and the constant fear of the disease that might claim them at any moment. Their quality of life was degraded, their years shortened, their potential unfulfilled. The statistics cannot capture the full measure of their suffering. The families of dial painters paid their own costs. Children grew up without mothers. Husbands lost wives. Parents buried daughters. Communities lost members who would never contribute what they might have contributed had they been allowed to live out their natural spans. The ripples spread outward, affecting people who had never touched a dial or a brush. Behind the statistics were individual women with individual stories, dreams, and loves. Grace Fryer, who had been one of the fastest dial painters in Orange, who had fought for justice even as her body crumbled, who had won a settlement that came too late to save her life. She died in February 1933 at the age of 30-4. Catherine Shaw, who had started work at just 14, who had painted thousands of dials over the years, who had joined the lawsuit against the company and lived to see some measure of justice. She died in February 1933, within days of Grace Fryer, Two friends who had worked together and suffered together finally reunited in death. Kinta MacDonald and Albina Larisse, the Magia sisters who had watched their sister Molly die and then joined the fight for justice. They survived longer than some of their colleagues, but carried the poison in their bones until the end. Kinta died in 1929, Albina in 1946, their sister's death never truly avenged. Catherine Donahue, the Ottawa dial painter who had become the face of the Illinois struggle, who had testified and fought even as she lay dying, who had won a verdict that established important precedents. She died in July 1938, just months after her victory. 34 years old. Each of these women had a full life ahead of her when she walked into the dial painting studio. Each had hopes and plans and people who loved her. Each was betrayed by an industry that valued profit over life. There were so many others whose stories deserved to be told. Edna Hussman, who joined the lawsuit despite knowing she would not live to see its conclusion. Marguerite Carlo, who survived long enough to testify but died before justice was fully achieved. Josephine Smith, whose case helped establish key legal precedents. The names go on and on, each one representing a life cut short, a family bereaved, a potential unrealized. The dial painters came from ordinary backgrounds, from families that valued hard work and hoped for better futures. They were daughters and sisters, wives and mothers, friends and neighbors. They went to church and attended social events and dreamed of homes and children and comfortable old age. They were, in every way that mattered, no different from the women of any other generation facing the challenges of their time. What set them apart was the terrible fate they shared and the courage with which many of them faced it. When they realized what had been done to them, they did not simply accept it. They fought back, demanding acknowledgement, seeking justice, trying to protect others from the same fate. Their courage in the face of suffering remains inspiring nearly a century later. Some of the dial painters became advocates in their final months and years, speaking out despite the physical toll it took. They gave testimony that was painful to deliver and painful to hear, describing in detail the deterioration of their bodies and the betrayal they had experienced. They subjected themselves to examinations and measurements, allowed their suffering to be documented, sacrificed their privacy for the sake of truth. Others fought in quieter ways, supporting their fellow dial painters, contributing to legal funds, providing information to investigators. They signed petitions and wrote letters and showed up at hearings even when they could barely stand. They refused to be invisible, refused to let the companies erase their existence and their suffering. The collective action of the dial painters was remarkable given the obstacles they faced. They were sick, often desperately so. They lacked resources and connections. They faced powerful corporations with teams of lawyers and friendly experts. Yet they persisted, finding strength in solidarity, supporting each other through the darkest times. For every dial painter whose story has been preserved, there are others who have been forgotten. Women whose names appear only in employment records or death certificates, whose stories were never told, whose suffering was never acknowledged. Some dial painters did not know that their illnesses were connected to their work. They died of cancer or bone disease or anemia, their cases attributed to other causes, their connection to radium never established. Their families grieved without understanding, without anyone to blame, without hope of justice that others were too sick or too poor to fight, accepting their fates in silence, dying without lawyers or headlines, or legal victories. The dial painters who sued and won were a small fraction of those who were harmed. The majority suffered alone, their stories lost to history. Even the dial painters who are remembered are often reduced to symbols, examples in textbooks, or cautionary tales in ethics courses. The full complexity of their lives, their personalities, their relationships, their hopes and fears is lost. They become the Radium Girls, a collective noun that obscures the individual women who lived and suffered and died. The dial painting factories left behind more than human suffering. They left contaminated buildings, soil, and water that would pose hazards for decades after the last dial was painted. The radium that had poisoned the workers had also saturated their workplaces, creating environmental problems that proved enormously difficult and expensive to address. The Orange, New Jersey factory with the United States Radium Corporation had operated became a Superfund site, requiring extensive cleanup that took years and cost millions of dollars. Radium had seeped into the soil, contaminated groundwater, and spread to neighboring properties. Homes built on former factory land showed elevated radiation levels, their residents unknowingly exposed to the same substance that had killed the dial painters. In Ottawa, Illinois, the legacy was equally troubling. The Radium Dial Company's factory and the land around it were heavily contaminated, requiring removal of vast quantities of soil. Radium had spread through the community, turning up in unexpected places, creating anxiety among residents who wondered what else might be lurking in their environment. Other dial painting sites scattered across the country faced similar problems. Each required assessment, cleanup, and monitoring that continued for years or decades. The environmental legacy of the dial painting industry proved nearly as persistent as the medical legacy, a reminder that the consequences of industrial misconduct can extend far beyond the immediate victims. Cleaning up radium contamination proved technically challenging and enormously expensive. Unlike some pollutants that break down over time, radium remains radioactive for thousands of years. There was no way to neutralize it, no treatment that could render it harmless. The only solution was removal, digging up contaminated soil and transporting it to secure disposal facilities. In Orange, cleanup operations removed thousands of cubic yards of contaminated material from the factory site and neighboring properties. Workers in protective suits excavated soil, demolished buildings, and loaded radioactive waste into containers for transport. The work took years and cost tens of millions of dollars. The cleanup efforts also revealed the extent of the contamination spread. Radium had been tracked out of the factories on workers' shoes and clothing, had been carried home and deposited in houses throughout the surrounding neighborhoods. Properties that had no direct connection to the dial painting industry turned out to be contaminated, their owners facing disruption and uncertainty. The legacy of contamination extended even to the dial painters' graves. Some cemeteries showed elevated radiation levels around the graves of women who had been buried with radium in their bones. The dead continued to emit radiation, a final reminder of the poison they had carried in life. Even today, the environmental legacy of the dial painting industry has not been fully addressed. Some contaminated sites remain, their cleanup incomplete or not yet begun. Some properties continue to show elevated radiation levels, their owners unaware of the history beneath their feet. The Dial Painters story serves as a warning about the long-term consequences of environmental contamination. Industries that produce hazardous waste must consider not just immediate profits, but lasting legacies. The costs of cleanup can far exceed the benefits of production, especially when those costs are borne by communities rather than companies. The environmental legacy of the dial painting industry extends to this day. Some sites remain on lists of contaminated properties, their cleanup incomplete or awaiting funding. Monitoring continues at locations where radium was handled, ensuring that contamination does not spread further. The poison left behind by the radium companies will require attention for generations to come. The story also illustrates the challenges of environmental justice. The communities affected by radium contamination were often working-class neighborhoods, home to people with limited resources to fight for cleanup or compensation. The factories had been welcomed as sources of jobs and economic activity, and questioning them meant challenging the economic foundations of the community. When the contamination was discovered, these communities lacked the political power to demand swift and thorough remediation. This pattern has repeated itself countless times across America. Poor and working-class communities bear disproportionate burdens of industrial pollution, while the profits flow elsewhere. The dial painter story is part of this larger history of environmental injustice, a reminder that the costs of industry are not always borne by those who benefit from it. The cleanup efforts also revealed tensions between economic and environmental priorities that persist today. Remediation is expensive, and the companies responsible for contamination often no longer exist or lack the resources to pay. Communities must choose between living with contamination and paying for cleanup themselves, often with inadequate government support. The dial painter's environmental legacy is thus not only physical but political. Their story contributed to the development of environmental law and the principle that polluters should pay for the damage they cause. The Superfund program, which has funded cleanup of many contaminated sites, including former radium facilities, emerged from the recognition that industrial contamination is a public responsibility and private parties cannot or will not address it. The years have passed, and the dial painters have largely faded from public memory. The factories where they worked have been demolished or repurposed. The cemeteries where they lie are visited by few. The newspaper headlines that once chronicled their struggle have yellowed and crumbled. A century has passed since the first women sat down at the painting tables and placed their brushes to their lips. Yet their story endures, preserved in books and articles, in museum exhibits and documentary films, in the legal precedents they established and the safety standards they inspired. Each new generation discovers the dial painters anew, learns their names and their fates, feels outrage at the injustice they suffered and admiration for the courage they displayed. The story endures because it speaks to something fundamental about the human condition, about the capacity for cruelty and the capacity for courage, about the forces that exploit the vulnerable and the forces that fight for justice. The dial painters were ordinary women in extraordinary circumstances, and their response to those circumstances reveals something important about what humans are capable of. The story also endures because its lessons remain relevant. The tactics used by the radium companies, the denial and delay, the corruption of science, the exploitation of workers, are still employed today. The dial painter's story helps us recognize these patterns and resist them. In the communities where the dial painters lived and worked, some people still remember. In Orange, New Jersey, local historians have documented the tragedy and preserved what records remain. In Ottawa, Illinois, descendants of the dial painters keep their memories alive, sharing stories passed down through generations. Some families have made it their mission to ensure that their relatives are not forgotten. They have collected photographs and letters, recorded oral histories, and donated materials to museums and archives. They have participated in commemorations and spoken to journalists and researchers. They have refused to let the dial painters fade into obscurity. Scientists and scholars have also kept the memory alive. Medical researchers continue to study the long-term effects of radium exposure, using data from the dial painters to inform understanding of radiation biology. Legal scholars cite the dial painters' cases as precedents and turning points. Historians write books and articles that introduce new audiences to the story. And storytellers, like myself, retell the tale in whatever medium reaches people. Tonight, as you listen to these words in the darkness, you become part of the chain of memory, another link connecting the dial painters' past to our present. By knowing their story, you help ensure that it is not forgotten. The act of remembering is itself a form of justice. The radium companies tried to erase the dial painters' suffering, to deny their claims, to bury the truth beneath layers of corporate propaganda and legal maneuvering. Every time we tell their story, we undo a small part of that attempted erasure. We affirm that these women existed, that what happened to them mattered, that their suffering deserves acknowledgement. Remembering is also a form of resistance. The powerful often prefer that the victims of their actions be forgotten, that the past remain buried, that accountability be avoided through the passage of time. When we remember the dial painters, we resist this erasure. We insist that the truth be told, that responsibility be acknowledged, that the lessons of the past inform the present. The dial painter's story is ultimately about power and its abuse, about the vulnerability of workers and the indifference of those who profit from their labor. It is about the long struggle to make corporations accountable for the harm they cause, a struggle that continues today in courtrooms and legislatures and workplaces across the country. The dial painters were early soldiers in this struggle, and their example still inspires those who fight for workers' rights. The story is also about courage, about ordinary people refusing to accept injustice, demanding recognition, fighting back even when the odds seemed impossible. The dial painters were not activists or radicals. They were working women who wanted only to earn a living and build lives for themselves. But when they discovered what had been done to them, they found reserves of strength they had not known they possessed. Their courage came in many forms. There was the physical courage to endure treatments and examinations, to testify when speaking was agony, to appear in public when their bodies had been ravaged by disease. There was the moral courage to challenge powerful institutions, to refuse settlements that seemed to validate corporate misconduct, to insist on justice even when compromise was easier. There was the emotional courage to face death openly, to use their remaining time to fight for others, to find meaning in suffering that might otherwise have seemed pointless. We who live in safer times owe the dial painters a debt we can never fully repay. The protections we enjoy, the rights we take for granted, exist in part because of what they endured. The least we can do is remember them, honor their memory, and ensure that their story continues to be told. And now, dear listener, as this long journey draws to its close, let us observe a moment of silence for the dial painters who suffered and died. For Grace Fryer and Catherine Schaub, for Molly Magia and her sisters, for Catherine Donahue and all the Ottawa women. For the hundreds whose names we do not know and whose stories were never told. They were young women who wanted nothing more than to work, to earn a living, to build lives for themselves and their families. They were betrayed by companies that valued profit over life, denied by scientists who corrupted their research, abandoned by a legal system slow to respond to their suffering. Yet they fought back, even as their bodies crumbled, and they won victories that protected workers for generations to come. Their bones still glow with radium, in graves scattered across America. They will continue to glow for centuries, long after we are gone, a permanent testament to what was done to them. But their legacy is not only in the poison they absorbed. It is in the laws they changed, the standards they established, the courage they displayed. Rest now, dear listener. Let the story settle into your memory as sleep approaches. Know that the world is a slightly better place because of what these women endured, because of what they fought for, because of what they achieved. The night is quiet. The factories are closed. The dial painters are at rest, and so may you be. Think of them as sleep approaches. Think of Grace Fryer, who fought for justice when her body was failing. Think of Catherine Donahue, who testified when she could barely speak. Think of Molly Maggia, whose death from radium poisoning was blamed on syphilis to protect the company that killed her. Think of the hundreds whose names we do not know, who suffered in silence, who were forgotten by history, but who deserve to be remembered. Their bones still glow in cemeteries across America. The radium they absorbed nearly a century ago continues to emit radiation, a physical reminder of what was done to them. In 1,000 years, their remains will still be radioactive, still carrying the evidence of corporate greed and human suffering. They have become, in a sense, permanent monuments to the dangers of unchecked industrial power. But their legacy is not only in the poison they absorbed. It is in the laws that protect workers today, in the standards that limit radiation exposure, in the principle that corporations can be held accountable for harming their employees. Every worker who goes home safe, every family that does not lose a breadwinner to occupational disease, every community that is not poisoned by industrial contamination owes something to what the dial painters endured. The night is quiet now. Let your thoughts drift toward sleep. Let the dial painter's story settle into your memory, to be recalled when you encounter injustice, when you see the powerful preying on the vulnerable, when you wonder whether one person's courage can make a difference. It can. The dial painters proved it. Their struggle changed the law, protected millions of workers, and established principles that endure to this day. They were ordinary women who did extraordinary things, and their example remains relevant nearly a century after the last dial was painted. Rest now. The morning will come, bringing new challenges and new opportunities for courage. But for now, in the quiet of the night, let yourself be at peace. The dial painter's watch is over. Their suffering has ended. Their legacy endures. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep well.